So we have an amazing panel of women who are going to talk about Femocracy. And it's a playful term. I mean, we're not really suggesting that the world would be carved into a different kind of inequality, i.e. that we would be looking for a society where female dominance was the name of the game. You don't look like you'd mind, actually, Jackie, but... But I mean, I think one of the things that creates anxiety is the idea that equality is actually a way of putting men into a different place in terms of inequality. And I don't think that's ever been an assumption that most women are trying to make at all, since we live with men, love men, and are often in a situation of defending and working very hard on behalf of men. But we certainly don't have democracies of the people, for the people, by the people. We don't have democracies where we could say, well, those phrases, of the people, by the people, for the people, actually relate to women's rights. I don't think there's one society in the world, not even the very good and well-practiced Nordic nations, have been able to say that they have achieved gender equality. And yet we use this word democracy, suggesting that the 52% of the world, which are women, have just as much say in what goes on as men do, and we know it to not be the case. So we're going to talk to our panellists about what kind of democracy, Femocracy, might they bring about if they could start all over again, really, and just wave a magic wand now and say, okay, this is what the world could look like. But let me just introduce them if you don't already know who they are. On my far left, we have the Honourable Jackie Trad MP. She's the member for South Brisbane, and she's the Deputy Premier, Treasurer and Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships. And she was elected to the Queensland Parliament in 2012. She's always been interested in how public policy shapes and forms our cities and our communities, and she has a Bachelor of Arts from Griffith University and a Master of Public Policy from University of Sydney. She's a second-generation Lebanese migrant. She grew up in a small family business. I'd like to talk about that later on as well, women and entrepreneurs. And she's entered the public arena speaking on behalf of community life, but particularly as well about First Nations and women. Then on her right is somebody also who has, very high office. She's the British High Commissioner to Australia, Her Excellency Menna Rawlings, CMG, and she's been in this position since April 2015. She joined the FCO in 1989, so that means you've had a lengthy career looking at diplomacy, foreign diplomacy, and where women sit in that. She was most recently a member of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office Management Board as HR Director, and she's had postings in Washington, Ghana, Israel, Kenya, and Brussels. She served as the Private Secretary, the Permanent Under Secretary, as well as Press Office and the Africa and EU Directorates. Good history there. I just came back from Russia, meeting the British Consulate in Russia, in St. Petersburg, and she is a small Asian woman from Bradford, and she said every single meeting was full of Russian men coming in, looking over her head, wondering where the guy was that was going to turn up and asking her for a cup of tea in the meantime. Yeah. But she gave as good as she got, I'm going to tell you. Then on my right, another Jackie, who I'm sure everybody knows. And incidentally, at this point in time, Jackie Huggins, I'm going to invite you to look. There's a handbag somewhere. Where's this famous handbag? Kathy. Kathy's got this handbag. Kathy, bring this handbag out now. This is Jackie Huggins. She's from Bijara and Birigubugujuru from Queensland. She's the co-chair of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. And she was the national coordinator co-chair. Okay, so national co-chair for the Aboriginal Women's Unit in 1984, and she's been on many steering committees of the Aboriginal Women's Task Force. Now, why have I got that sitting there? Because Jackie is fully intending to go to the UN, to the
United Nations Permanent Forum on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Next Friday.
Next Friday. So with a week to go, and the government unable to afford the airfare.
I have to do it all myself.
This wonderful handbag is a work of art, and we're going to auction it today, is that correct, or over the weekend, with the intention of raising the money for Jackie to go to the UN, to this incredibly important forum. Now, you wouldn't think you'd have to do that, would you? But that's what we're going to do. So, at what point, Kathy, is this auction going to happen? People will be coming round. You know, it's one of those. People will be coming round. So, Jackie was the first Indigenous woman to chair the Queensland Ministerial Council for Domestic Violence and was on the Indigenous Reference Group for 14 years, the Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research. And she, in honour of this work, she's been granted an honorary degree from Queensland University, and she's written widely on women's issues, feminism and history. Zainah Anwar, very, very glad, flew in yesterday from Singapore with me and then from Malaysia. She's the co-founder of two groundbreaking women's rights groups, Sisters in Islam in Malaysia and Musawa, which is a global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. And she also became the founding executive director. She's also the founding executive director of the Musawa SIS-initiated global movement launched in Kuala Lumpur in 2009. And she's been named by Huffington Post, amongst many others on the Daily Beast, as one of the 150 women who shake the world. She's been inspiring the Muslim community to rethink and relook at what Muslim teaching means as far as women are concerned, what Muslim law means as far as women are concerned, and being unafraid to tackle ideas of cultural tradition versus theological accuracy. And she sits on the CEDAW processes, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which was signed by the UN in 1979, but which the US, amongst other countries, still haven't signed, which we'll come back to. Somalia, Sudan and the US, I think, are the three nations, prominent nations, and Iraq, that haven't yet signed that. And then finally, but not least, Senator Kim Pate, who was appointed to the Senate of Canada on November the 10th, 2016. Which I think is a very significant thing. I think, if I'm right, you were asked by Justin Trudeau to become a senator, based on the work that you've done over the last 36 years around the Canadian legal system, and particularly around the penal system. And you've worked tirelessly, because you have a very strong reputation for this, for the penalised, the criminalised and the institutionalised, and particularly for women. She was the executive director of the Canadian Association of the Elizabeth Fry Societies from 1992 to 2016, when she became a senator. And she's developed and taught prison law, human rights and social justice, and defended battered women on trial courses at many universities. So all of these women, as you can see, have spent their life thinking about how to use their professional and personal commitment to change the life of girls and women. Now, if you were inventing democracy today, you wouldn't presumably make it just exactly what it is in terms of representation. So, Jackie, what would democracy look like if we had a gender equal world?
Thank you, Jude, and good morning, everyone. It's very exciting to be here, but can I say I'm incredibly impressed by the panellists here today, so I'm sure we're up for a very good conversation. I guess from my perspective, if there was a blank page and we could write the democracy that we would want, from my perspective, I think it would, in Australia, fundamentally, it would have to be formed on the basis of a treaty with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I think any sort of new democracy would have to start with the acknowledgement of the rights and the custodianship of Australia's First Nations people. Then I think that we would have to form a democracy where there was clear rules around representation. And listening to your story, Jude, I was thinking about similarities with my story. I'm one of 4 girls as well. There was one boy in my family growing up, and I grew up in a pretty patriarchal culture, And that really spurred me on to think about things in a very different way. And I was very appreciative of my love of literacy. That gave me an insight into the things that women in the past have done and could do, and that really propelled me to think about my life in a different way from the lives of the women around me. As much as I love them, I didn't necessarily want to become a mother at a very young age and enter a life of decades of domesticity and servitude around a family. So that really did get me thinking about things and spurred me on to go to uni. And I was the first one in my large extended family to go to university, and that really did change the way I thought about things. One quote, and please excuse the source of the quote. It was in a cubicle in a bathroom at QUT Gardens Point at the time. But seriously, it was scratched on the back of the toilet door, the cubicle door, and there were a lot of quotes there, but it essentially said, revolution is the celebration of an oppressed people. Women are oppressed. And I thought, yeah, they are, and I want to be part of that revolution. And from the time that I was a young university student to now, I have dedicated a large part of my passion, my engagement, my professionalism into turning the dial around women's involvement, engagement and leadership in the political system. And I'm so glad that I did, because today I'm sitting here as the Deputy Premier of Queensland, serving a woman Premier of Queensland who has taken the Labor Party into government from opposition and retained government, so won an election from government, and I think that's a pretty impressive thing. But we've done that on the shoulders of many feminist activists within the Labor Party, I myself being one, and today we can sit here and go, half of the Labor Party representatives in the Queensland Parliament are women, and half of the women sitting around the cabinet table, half of the people sitting around the cabinet table are women. And that is because of the rules that we put in place. And fundamentally, rules do benefit those communities, those cohorts who have for a long time struggled to emerge, to flex their muscle, to have influence in a system that has been so overwhelmingly dominated by white, middle-class, middle-aged men.
Okay, I'm just interested. Hands up who in this room, can you put the lights on the audience for a minute? Hands up who would call themselves a feminist activist? Okay, hands in this panel, yeah? Yes, okay. 5 years ago, hands up who would call themselves a feminist activist 5 years ago? Okay, less. Hands up who would still find that phrase, and there's no problem with if you find that phrase uncomfortable. What about all the people who didn't put their hands up then? Where are they? Okay, so what I think is very interesting, that some people have, is that it's still very contested language. I mean, I think it's an extraordinary step forward for people to use the word activism as something which just is a positive meaning, and feminist as a positive meaning. But I think there's a long way to go on the language that one uses to be able to say, this is what I'm striving for. And certainly in Russia recently, and in China recently, where we've just done the first WOW, complicated around that. But you've said, basically, rights for First Nation people and Indigenous people, education, political systems, being part of political systems, and making rules that insist on those things are part of your democracy. Absolutely. So, Menna, let me come to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jude. And once again, it's just really great to be here, and I'm really honoured to be asked to be on this panel. So thank you very much. I mean, you touched briefly on my story. I think one of my reflections is that when I joined the Foreign Office in 1989, there were very few women in diplomacy, not just in the British Foreign Service, but around the world. And it's still a bit of a contested space, I think. But, you know, when I joined, we only had 2 British female ambassadors anywhere in the world. and the first mum to be posted as an ambassador had only been done so in 1987, 2 years before I joined. And now we have about 62 women like me around the world who lead our posts, and it's still not enough. We're at about 30% overall, but gosh, we have come a long way, so that's always my starting point. And I think, I didn't really notice some of these issues, to be honest, for a long time. I just put my head down and got on with it. And it's only with the benefit of hindsight I can sort of see the impact that had on me in terms of my own confidence and ability to express myself within the organisation. And one of the great things about sticking with it and becoming a leader is that you can acknowledge much more the power that you do have to change things. So even in quite a traditional institution, and the role that I have, quite a traditional sort of role, I'm always really keen to use the power and influence that I do have to, yes, to be a feminist activist and to be proud of that. But to answer your question, if we had a true femocracy, I think, just picking up on Jackie's points, education, but if we look globally and think about the gender gap that still exists around the world and the fact that girls are just much less likely still than boys to even go to school ever, I think that's absolutely something that we need to keep addressing, including through the Sustainable Development Goals with the goal of gender equality in education by 2030. But at the moment, 32 million fewer girls than boys go to school, and that's got to change if we're going to have a true democracy, femocracy. Secondly, roles, gender roles. My husband is a primary carer. In our family, we have 3 kids. One of them just flew in this morning from London, so if I'm a bit bleary, that's why. But, we took a decision 20 years ago that actually we'd go with my career and he would step into that job. And it's becoming easier, but I think it's still not actually straightforward. So I would love to see more men here, and I would love to see more men willing to be flexible and adaptable in their own interpretation of what masculinity means. My husband is a bloke's bloke, there's no doubt about that. He likes darts and Chelsea and beer, but he has been a fantastic primary carer to our kids, and I wouldn't be where I am today without him. So, let's keep pushing those gender roles and accepting different ways for blokes to be blokes as well as women to do the different things that we do. And then finally, and I think it speaks to Jackie's point about First Peoples, I think broader inclusion. We have just appointed our first black female career ambassador in the Foreign Office. It's 2018. It's great that's finally happened, but in a country like the UK with such a strong ethnic mix, London is an amazing global city, and white Brits in London are now in a minority, and we've just appointed our first black female ambassadors. Let's celebrate it, but let's also say, frankly, that's not good enough. Let's be more inclusive, not just about women, but in terms of bringing all the diversity of our amazing countries into leadership roles. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you, if you'd joined the Foreign Office and 50% of the leadership had been women, and they had all been called feminist activists, what do you think foreign policy would look like now, just from a British point of view?
I think that's a really good question, and quite a tough question.
Yes.
I don't know. I'd have to think about it. I think what you have seen is certainly issues around development and gender much more come into the mainstream, even with statistics that I've set out. We do now have our own ambassador for gender equality following the Australian model, actually, but again, that's only within the last 2 years. I think that might have happened a bit sooner. I think there's a risk that you sort of assume that the blokes doing diplomacy are interested in conflict and resolving conflict and taking on some of those issues, and that the women are interested in climate change and development. And I actually don't think that's true, and I think that's a trap we need to avoid. I think what matters is that we have a diverse representation of voices as possible in developing that foreign policy, including on the leadership. And although we haven't got a foreign minister who's female like Australia, we do have a lot of very senior women in the system now, I think, who are influencing and shaping that debate.
I wouldn't suggest that women have to call themselves anything. The reason I said let's call it WOW is if you're a woman or you know one, it'll be for you. Was the only criteria. But because so many women have historically got into power and felt that the way to preserve the power was to maintain the status quo and demonstrate they could do the status quo, including the set agendas. Actually, it's quite hard for women to shift the dial of the themes of democracy. And interestingly, in Sweden recently, they have created a feminist foreign policy with a feminist defence spending framework, which, again, suggests not just that women can be in leadership, but that they can take on a kind of different criteria when they're there. So perhaps we'll come back and talk about that more. But just finally, on your point about intersection, I'm sure that we agree we don't want a world where white women assume the power that white men have had, and then sort of divvy out bits of power on a sort of we'll see how we feel level to everybody else. I mean, unless we can have an intersectional world where people's communal rights are the starting point, then actually I don't think feminism will have done anything very worthwhile. Jackie, let's talk about what kind of democracy you would invent if you were the goddess of democracy and you were going to start it now.
Oh, sorry.
That's yours. Yeah.
Right, well, of course, it has to be... firstly, I wish to acknowledge the Turrbal and Jagera peoples of the land that we're on, my hometown of Brisbane. It's always great to be here, even though I come from Central and North Queensland's are my ancestral country. Like my namesake, Jackie Trad, Jackie Huggins, I come from a family, I don't think we knew this, Jack, but I come from a family of 4 girls and 1 boy as well. So there you go, we're more commonalities. Here we are.
Where are you in the birth?
Oh, I'm actually in the middle child. Number 2. Are you number 2? Yeah, I'm number 3. And baby brother is, well, he's copped it from the women all his life and still continues to be bossed around by me mostly. But look, it's incredible that, you know, we live in 2018, yet we have not seen a treaty for our people in this country. The only Commonwealth country on earth that has never signed a treaty with its Indigenous peoples, its original inhabitants. That's got to change. Here. So, of course, that would be the premise, and I look forward to the Queensland government, like South Australia and Victoria, starting and commencing those negotiations, Jack, I really do. Look, I want to say that what would it look like for me? Of course, it would have to be a 50-50 gender split, as we have in my organisation, the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. We have mandated this because, as you know, some of you will know, prior to this, we had an organisation called ATSIC, which was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. Now, while ATSIC did some good stuff, it also did some bad stuff. Unfortunately, in 2005, ATSIC was abolished. Look, I won't go into it, it's a long story, but I was on the review committee for that. And really, we didn't want to abolish ATSIC. We wanted to regionalise it. And we wanted to give more power to women's voices. That was a great void in the whole process. Now, luckily, I became involved in a steering committee with the then Social Justice Commissioner, Tom Calma, and we established the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples after 8 years. And we said, no more. No more will the voices of women not be heard in this process. I had asked that it be legislated with the ATSIC review. I had to do never get it. What is it? The discerning report or something? Dissenting, okay. Never get that word, you know. The dissenting report. The 2 white blokes, of course, voted against me in terms of a 50-50 gender split. But I said, look, you know what? This is a cultural imperative here. We're talking about men's business and women's business. If we don't get the structures right, then we need to legislate it within the Constitution. So I said, Aboriginal men, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men may not like me anymore. That's not too good because I come from a family full of men. But Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women will love me, and I hope that's still the case. As it is now, our organisation really, it's not questioned anymore. And what we're finding in communities also is that understanding that where you have a man, you're going to have a woman talking with him, and vice versa in most communities. Of course, in some communities that is not the case. But there is an understanding now that this gender equity principle is really, really important. So that, of course, would be one of the imperatives for me. It would also be around good leadership, stable leadership, inspirational, for people to have honesty and integrity, to do what they say they will do, not BS to you all the time and not follow through with promises. So I think that would be really good in a democracy. Also, I just want to take up the point around language, and language is so powerful that the contested language, certainly in this country, has been there for a number of years, for quite some time. I remember the 80s, where I was the only Indigenous woman at forums such as this, speaking about Indigenous women's rights and getting howled down by the white feminists in the audience. Howled down when I would mention the support that we need to apply to our Aboriginal brothers, our husbands, our spouses, our sons, our brothers, our uncles. I would be held down. Now, I've seen there has been a shift in that too, to know that, we've got to bring these people along. We have to have them at our side. We have to support them, and they have to support us. So that has never changed. But in terms of the feminist dialogue in this country, I think that has moved somewhat in that space. Also, this term feminism does not particularly have relevance to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. The term is not really our term. It can be seen as an ethnocentric term. We, as I've always said, but we haven't quite come up with it, have to find our own term, and I've been saying that for ages. In the States, Alice Walker, the great author, has termed womanist. Their term is womanist. I think here we have a titterism, which is like a sisterhood, a titterism. Maybe it's, being a sisterist, I don't know. But, we had a number of some young Indigenous academics at Melbourne Uni working on, what that might look like. But unfortunately, that sort of died out. But I think it's really important that somehow, we will have that term, and what that term will be will certainly show itself. But we are quite different in terms of our approach, our culture, and the way that we see ourselves, our worldview in terms of being a woman, where we've come from. Like all women of the world, we are nurturers, we are the educators, and we're the backbone of our communities. Thank you.
Okay. There is an underlying idea that, we are committed to the idea of loving people and therefore being respectful and honest, and that includes loving men. The idea of policing language is not part of democracy in this new democracy. It isn't a policed language. In other words, people can make their own choices, perhaps, around some of this language. I mean, it's certainly true from WOW's point of view that if you go to different parts of the world, it just isn't appropriate to assume that feminism as the word is the kind of accolade that you will give to say somebody understands gender rights. That's just not true. And so this kind of recalibration where people can make choices around language is a very important part of this democracy as well, I think. Because I think we're talking about a kind of a global notion of democracy, aren't we? We're not just talking about Australia or the UK or wherever. And that brings me on to Malaysia, because one of the things that you notice when you're traveling around the world is that people have preconceptions about different places, and they also have an assumption that, well, this place is better than this place. There is a gender deficit in every single place, and some are more visible than others about it. And Malala came to WOW a couple of years ago, and she said, well, the thing is, the good thing about Pakistan is everybody knows it's not equal. It's so obvious. She said, and then you go to other places and they're hiding it like mad. But, you know, you look under the cover, as it were, and the violence against women is just terrible. And, you know, issues to do with equal pay are so terrible as well, but they'd like to keep it hidden. So, I mean, what about, is democracy even the right word? I mean, where do you feel that you would place a political framework that would allow equality for women to exist? What would you invent?
Well, certainly in Malaysia, it's in a pathetic state. Malaysia is a high middle income country. And yet, in terms of women's representation, it's really, really very, very bad, you know, at the decision-making position. I mean, we only have 2 women cabinet members out of 32, so that's like less than 6%. We only have about 10% women members of parliament. And yet, in the universities, as in many countries, you know, we have far more women. Almost 70% of the students in the universities are women. In all faculties, there are more women than men, except engineering. So in law, in medicine, in computer science, in the sciences, all more women than men. In the professions, too, there are more women than men. I think something like, I've got the data here, 55%. 55% of professionals are women, but yet at the decision-making position, it's all below 10%. It's really, really very bad. And I think in a country like Malaysia, where that remains entrenchedly patriarchal, and in a country where religion then is used to justify that patriarchy and used to justify the resistance to change, you know, to silence voices because this is God's law, it's very, very difficult to bring the kind of changes that we want. And that's why I'm a strong believer in the need for rules and for quota system, because to wait for society to change, it's not going to happen. And if you don't have a leadership, a political leadership that believes in change, it's going to be even more difficult. You know, so it's really about the need to, you know, obviously there are many, many, many qualified women in Malaysia to hold decision-making positions. You know, so how do you establish the rules to make it easier for women to get in? You know, a quota system. You know, over 60 countries in the world have a legislated quota for women to get into politics. You know, I think some political parties in Malaysia have a voluntary system, but it's really not working. If it's voluntary, it's not working, you know, especially within a conservative society. So I really believe in the importance of representation, of inclusion, as everybody else has said, and participation. So once you're in power, once you have a system, you know, that allows these people to get in, it's like, how do you establish a participatory process? You know, very often, you know, the work that I do is really about creating voice. It's about the importance of women's voice in the public space. And in many societies, that remains a radical notion. I mean, the idea that women should be treated as human beings of equal worth and dignity is so radical, you know. The idea that a woman who has a voice is a rebel, is disruptive, is going against culture and tradition and religion. You know, so this is the context in which we're working, and the work that I do is really about bringing out women's voice to interrogate decisions made, in particular in my work, decisions made in the name of religion, how God's voice or God's words, text, you know, what is authoritative is used for authoritarian purposes. And when women challenge that, we're accused of going against God's word and God's voice and God's law, when it is men's words, men's voice, men's law. We're still not connecting that, God does not speak unless human beings speak, and that what we're challenging is the voices, the understanding, the interpretations made by human beings. But it's very convenient to hide behind God and say this is God's law that we are challenging. So it's really about getting more voices out there, really representing those who are marginalized, those who are voiceless, really within that context of a conservative society, that we have to have rules, we have to have clear policies to ensure that those who are marginalized and those who are voiceless are given that opportunity to come out, through that. Because to wait for a natural process of waiting for society to change, when society is ready, it's never going to be ready. We have to push to make it ready and help to make it ready.
Okay, so there's absolute unity here so far about quotas. And Jackie, you talked about that, that actually there's just no way around it. You have to simply say, we're not just going to wait to get there, we've got to get there now. And then you've got to sort of work out how to do it. But this issue of faith, again, every country suffers from the idea that there is a theological notion of the divinity is male. The divinity of knowledge, this affects all areas of the notion of creativity. Females can't be geniuses, really, in most ideas of creativity, because it comes from the man. If God is a man, it has to be down through men and then given off to women as an accessory to the fact. And even when you have societies that divide state and religion, as we do in the UK, nevertheless, in the House of Lords, all the bishops sit, and there is still this idea that men's law is also God's law. So in societies that have faith very central to their daily life, do you see a way that the faith groups are starting to unlock some of this idea about divinity related to maleness? Is this part of your forward plan?
Yeah, that's precisely the work that I've been doing for the past 30 years, actually, before Islam became fashionable in the world. The group that I helped to found, Sisters in Islam, in the late 1980s, precisely because of this, because all these laws and policies and pronouncements were being made in the name of religion to justify why women should stay at home, why women shouldn't be in leadership position, why the laws that discriminate against women cannot be changed because these are God's law, they are divine law. And that's really why, my group was formed, to really challenge this. Because when you go back, to the Quran, to the source of these discriminatory laws, you find incredible verses and message and values in the Quran that talk about, compassion and justice and equality, and men and women being each other's friend and each other protector. And the natural question that arose to us, how come this voice in the Quran that talks about equality, that talks about justice, that talks about compassion, why isn't this voice reflected in the lawmaking process, in the way societies are organized, in the way that men and women's relations are organized? Why the patriarchal voice, the patriarchal understanding, why did that dominate? And obviously, for us, it was so clear, this is about the issue, of privilege, of who has the authority to decide this interpretation will be the source of law and public policy and public practice, and this other interpretation that also exists, this other egalitarian voice that exists in the text and in the tradition shall be shunted aside and shall be pushed aside. It's the men in authority. So until women's voice get heard in that public space, then the patriarchal voice is going to dominate. So that's why we decided to form a group called Sisters in Islam, claiming our authority and our right to speak in the name of Islam, to challenge that misogynistic patriarchal voice. And that has to happen in all Muslim societies where religion is used as a source of law and public policy. There has to be an alternative voice. There has to be a feminist voice. There has to be an alternative narrative that speaks out about an Islam that upholds justice and equality. This is really an imperative, and democracy in Muslim countries cannot develop without the democratization of the understanding of Islam as well.
Okay. You're doing a session on faith on this issue, aren't you, today, later on Sunday, which I think is an important one to go to, because it's interesting you use the word Islam's become fashionable, and I love that. If only it was just fashionable, because that's such a positive word. And one of the things that you notice is that when Islamophobia starts circling around, it's extremely difficult for Islamophobia not to produce a locking back down into even more restrictive practices. So we all need to be involved in all faith-based cultures, I think. I said not least, but let's talk about Canada, because Canada has bloomed suddenly under Justin Trudeau, who I know, as I say, invited you to be a senator, and who has unequivocally said, I'm a man and I believe in gender equality because this is a world I want to live in. Do you see that there is an attempt to reframe democracy in Canada at the moment, and what could that look like?
Well, thank you for that question. I'm going to first do something else. I want to also acknowledge the traditional owners of this territory. It's been lovely to be a few days here in Mianjin and to acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging of the Jagera and the Turrbal people. And as someone who lives and works in Algonquin territory, otherwise known to you as Ottawa in Canada, and as someone who for much of the past 4 decades has walked in, but most importantly been able to walk out of prisons for young people, for men, and for the past 25, 26 years for women and girls. It's painfully obvious the impact of colonization. And so I want to start there. And I also want to thank my colleagues, Digging Roots, for yesterday singing part of the Strong Woman song. If you want to hear more about where that song came from, I'll talk about it a bit in our workshop on Sunday. It actually was a song, an honor song for the Indigenous women who died in the prison for women in Kingston, which is where I started my work with women in prison, and so very important. So thank you for that. And I also want to say an interesting theme. I'm the eldest of 4 girls, so I don't have any brothers, but so an interesting theme, and the first in my family to get in post-secondary education. And so as someone who has transitioned class but started as a working class kid, it's painfully obvious, again, the impact of impoverishment in terms of economic, racial, and equality, impoverishment in terms of equal opportunities that impact. So to answer your question, yes, Justin Trudeau has said that he's a feminist, and he put 50 women in cabinet, or 50% of the women in cabinet are women. However, they're not all the major portfolios, and that's been an issue. And there's certainly a long way to go. And so when I think of this issue, I think of a broader picture. So Femocracy might not be the word, and I appreciate Jackie bringing us there. It may be something else. And I'd like to talk about what it will not be if we move forward. And one of the things is it will not be men in drag. I don't think women in leadership should try. I think too often what it's meant is women have tried to operate in the way men do in patriarchal structures, and tried to operate and have been forced to. And this is not a criticism of our foremothers who have had to break the ground that way. That was the only way they could. But if we're actually talking about starting something different, then we start about putting the interests that we actually privilege first. So we are all, in Canada, we are all treaty peoples. We have not honored our treaties, though, and I think definitely looking at how do we actually honor and express value in what we actually think is useful. So we don't honor right now in most countries in this world, including, I would say, I would agree, in more so in Scandinavian countries, but we honor those who are raising the next generations, whether they're the mothers, the fathers, the childcare providers, the teachers, the nurses. And I was just reminded of this when my son was in hospital just before I came away. And doctors and managers of administrators of many of our hospitals in Canada get bonuses if they get people out of hospital quicker. And all the nurses are talking about the need for preventative care. So that led me to think about, if we're coming forward, we also need to be ensuring that we're not just making new paths for the privileged women, but that we're actually bringing with us those who don't otherwise get access, who don't have the same opportunities to access the privilege, the resources, the power that comes with many of these positions. And I'm reminded of a group of women lifers who very early in my career instructed me and said, it is just as disrespectful for you to come in and speak for us as it is for you to come in and just amplify our voices. And it took me a while to understand what they meant. And what they were telling me is, if you have access to information, information is power. If you have access to education, education is power. If you have access to resources, resources means power. And if you don't come in willing to share all of that and then change your views, assist us in understanding so we can change our views and attitudes too, then you are being just as disrespectful as if you ignore us or just parrot our voices. And that was a really important lesson to learn. So we would not just parrot. And so I think we can't imagine exactly how incredibly rich new structures would be if we actually said we will ensure that the resources are shared, that yes, we bring more people in, but if we start, in our country, one of the things a number of us are working on is starting with things like, we are treaty people, we need to honor the treaties that have been disrespected. We need to have a strong nation-to-nation relationship with our First Nations, our Métis, and our Inuit people. We also need to ensure that we have guaranteed livable incomes, that we no longer make poor people feel bad about being poor and make social workers police incomes, that we actually say, if you are here, we are a rich country, and if we can and should be making sure everybody in our country is fed, clothed, housed, and educated. And if we do that, then everybody will have more opportunities, and it will change how we actually see the world. It also means that we need to have the courage to make hard decisions. This is a privileged position I'm in now. I will be in that position unless I cark it until I'm 75 years old or unless I quit. And the reality is, so many of the policies that are developed are policies that are developed based on a very short time frame, an electoral time frame. And part of the responsibility that I didn't even know until one of our friends from Australia actually was visiting and read my commission, was part of our responsibility is to represent minority interests in our country. That means people who otherwise don't have a voice because they're not seen as powerful or important enough for those who are elected to take note of. So that means that we have a responsibility to think generations. In our country, we talk about 7 generations to come for what the impact of our policies are. Because most every decision that is taken right now that leads to the inequality based on race, based on gender, based on class, based on ableism, based on sexual orientation, you name it, is fundamentally based in discriminatory and unequal access to resources and power. And those are policy decisions that we can and must change. So I think we need to also ensure that whoever comes forward has the courage to be making decisions for 7 generations to come, not just for the next electoral period. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. In the way that you said, you know, women in the future leadership, make sure they're not, you know, basically men in drag, that idea of restructuring democratic process to have a long-term view as well as the short-term opportunistic style, which we've become so used to, electoral practice basically being we need to just basically get the next election won, which makes it hard to put in place things which can be unpopular and difficult to deal with, hard to negotiate for a long time. So how do you think democracy can be created in order to do that? Now, in the UK, this is a weird thing to say, but we have the House of Lords, as you know, which used to be all a house based on total entitlement. It's increasingly a house of people who have expertise in various things, who don't really have a political axe to grind as much, who hang about until they die, and try to nudge better policies. It's very interesting to watch how this almost non-democratic space is becoming a place that is more like the House of Commons than a house that's full of people who've basically got degrees in politics and economics from Oxford and Cambridge. So how would you create a democracy that had that long-term view?
Well, if I had all the answers, then I'd probably be somewhere else. I don't know. I don't have all the answers.
Well, you might one day, yes.
Yeah. But I mean, when the Prime Minister called me, he actually did say it was the activism that I'd been working on in the nonprofit sector and the women's sector and criminal justice sector all my life, that was what he wanted to see in leadership. And I took that seriously, and I think many of those of us who have been appointed through the new process have also taken it seriously. It's a nonpartisan process, and many of us had been asked to run for parties in the past. I, for one, had never agreed to run for any of the parties that asked me because none of them had sufficiently progressive policies on social justice or criminal justice issues in particular. And so I see it as our responsibility when in those positions, if we're not every day using the power and privilege and resources that I now have access to, more than I have ever had in my entire life, then I don't deserve to be in that position. And I actually have kept a constituency, including people in prison. When just last week before I came, I was in prisons in the eastern part of the country with some of my colleagues. And every one of those prisoners, unless the authorities turn off the ability to watch the television, are glued to the set while we're doing a study of prisons. Our Senate Human Rights Committee is doing a study on prisons. And they know, and they do call and hold us to account. And I think we need to be challenging people we don't often talk to about holding us to account for those positions. And we have, we now will soon be a majority of the independent senators, and many of us have stopped and interrupted the process of legislation that we feel does not address the issues that needs to be. Now, that isn't historically what our Senate has done. Our Senate historically essentially rubber-stamped legislation that came from the House of Commons, and we're expected to not interfere with the mandate of the elected bodies. But where we see that they're not fulfilling that mandate, for instance, our government said that they would interfere with the number of mandatory minimum sentences. So there's some of us who are interfering with legislation that is not furthering what was actually part of their electoral platform. So there are ways, I mean, part of my challenge is to have the patience, quite frankly, to do that step-by-step process and keep being reminded by elders and people that I'm in touch with, you know, remember, it's you're a step in the right direction. And I was just saying this morning with Debbie and Tracy and Sandra, as we were sitting having coffee, that as we're making those steps forward, I think we haven't gone very far. And then I have someone call me up and say, I just met with this senator who's in, you know, I'm not going to name but a particularly conservative senator who was just talking about how important it was that we're all going into the prisons now. Mm-hmm. People who are making laws and policies, and you know, Louise Arbour has said it, if you're making a law or policy that impacts someone and you don't know who those people are that are being impacted, you have no business making the law, especially if it's a criminal law and you've never been inside a prison.
We had an incident recently which probably reached here, Grenfell Tower fire. And at the WOW in London, we had all the groups from Grenfell Tower talking about the impact it has had on their lives. All the groups actually were run by women. And that's not a coincidence. Over and over again, you see that the groups who are bringing together civil issues and staying the course on them tend to be women. And that, I think, is a deficit for men. Their reluctance, inability or uncertainty around being able to be part of the civil space for change that doesn't have any obvious power in it, but is absolutely critical. But the thing that was very clear from Grenfell Tower was that most of the people who were making social housing policy had no knowledge of the lives of those people and didn't live anywhere near. And so that kind of notion that you have to allow the voices of the dispossessed or less heard, not only to be heard, but actually to be expert witnesses on a way that we ought to be. I think this is the next step, isn't it, for democracy? You have to have people not just being spoken about or for, but included with more voice.
More voice, but also more access to the information that can actually amplify their voice in a way that isn't just about parroting. And I'll give you an example. When we go into prisons, if we say, should we get rid of segregation or solitary confinement, the majority of people in prison, staff and prisoners, initially will say, oh no, you can't do that, because if you're only used to operating in a certain way and you only have limited information, you only come up with limited options. And I think part of our responsibility is to provide more opportunity for people to have greater awareness of what the range of possibilities is. And that's why I also think we should be looking at things like free education, and not just, because increasingly people are going to private education for school kids, but also university education is increasingly becoming capitalist. And the number, yes, there are more women there, but they don't tend to be more women who will necessarily want to change the status quo.
Yeah. And I'm going to come to the audience shortly for questions from you. A couple more things I want to say. When you have a majority, or not, you haven't got a majority of women, when you've got enough women in the Foreign Office or in government, you begin to feel that you won't be picked off, that you'll be able to stand together. But in Malaysia, and that's just one example of many, where there are so few women representatives, it must be very, very difficult for them to cross the line and open up and make challenges happen on a regular basis, because presumably they get punished professionally and personally. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's very, very true. I mean, that's why we talk about having a critical mass. You know, it's important to have that critical mass in any kind of platform where women are entering. Because if you don't have that support, then your voice just gets drowned. And not only that, like you said, you get punished. So many women are not in parliament. Many of them are not feminists, but even if they're feminists, they have to kind of like tone down, because you get punished by the party system. I mean, I think this is one reason why many feminists don't want to enter party politics, because, there's a price to be paid if you step out of line, but if you have a critical mass and you begin to change the rules of the game, then, the staying power, you'd have, a much better staying power. But yeah, without that critical mass, it's really so hard to bring the kind of change that you want to.
Jackie, you wanted to?
Yeah, just quickly, and even having the mass numbers doesn't equate to solving the problems, unfortunately. Still in our country, the highest rates of family domestic violence, the highest rates of Aboriginal women incarcerated. In this country, fastest growing prison population are Aboriginal women, and that is with Indigenous women, as I understand it, Kim, all over the world. The highest rates, even though, we're 3%. So there are systems also that need to change in our country. We've just been on this exercise around, closing the gap. 3 out of the 7 targets have not, are on track, but woeful and dismal. We're going backwards in many cases. So, but with women there, it's obviously raise the voice, raise the profile, and to say, we're not going to be silenced and we're not going to be ignored again, but still very intractable problems that still present within our communities, I would suspect, all over the world.
You wanted to, yeah.
Yeah, just one comment, I think, which is, one of my reflections has been, it's very easy for us to feel good about this stuff. So I have a wonderful group of women who are also heads of mission from other countries in Canberra, and we get together and we support each other. For International Women's Day, I did an event called Mingling and Mentoring, where we brought in 10 amazing women to mentor younger women, younger professional women in Canberra, and it was, really successful, and we gave ourselves a pat on the back. And of course, we should keep doing those things, but I think that's just the starting point. The scariest thing I've done, not kidding, in the last 3 or 4 months is I went to an all-boys college at Queensland University, or the University of Queensland. I won't name it, I think there's only 2, so you can probably work it out. And I'd been asked there to give their sort of academic commencement speech. And I thought I'd give a talk about feminism. So my title of my talk was "Feminism is not just for the boys." Sorry, feminism is also for the boys. I went in, it was a bit Harry Potterish, there were long tables of lots of sort of privileged guys. And I started speaking, and for the first time in a long time, I felt really lonely. And I actually found it quite hard to keep going, because they weren't hostile at all. They were very polite, they were very well-mannered. But that sort of warmth that we're all getting from you, lovely people, wasn't there. And it was a really... It was a great learning experience for me, and I just think we need to keep challenging ourselves to get out, whether that be different socioeconomic groups or, get in the mix with the guys and say to them, feminism isn't just for us, it's also for you. And your point about Grenfell is so well made. And one of the points I was making to them is, we are brilliant at networking and supporting each other. Guys are going to need a bit more of that. And if you look at male suicide rates, or the challenges facing young men, young white men in particular actually in the UK, who aren't succeeding through our education system, who are very threatened by technology and the technological revolution. Guys, you need to start doing some of what we do to put our arms around each other. Anyway, I think maybe 1 or 2 got the message, and perhaps that was enough for that day, but it was an interesting experience for me.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, because sometimes I hear people say, but this generation, it's kind of sorted. And you go, I'm sorry, but it's not. I mean, thank God the trans community, the LGBTQI community have made massive progress. We have shifted some cultural barriers, and, gender fluidity is a discussion you can have in London, and maybe it's happening in Brisbane, I don't know. But it is certainly not happening in Beijing. And, and it's not happening in Moscow. And it's an illusion to think that all boys are kind of coming out now, newly made, and it just isn't the case. So if we don't attend to those conversations, as you say, and we think, well, we're nearly there, we will be making a mistake. Jackie?
Just quickly, just following on from that, I absolutely agree. I mean, part of our responsibility, and I'm the mother of 2 boys, I think it's karma that I was one of 4 girls and 1 boy, and now I'm the mother of 2 boys. Part of my responsibility is absolutely having those conversations with my sons and their friends. And one of the things that I did, and if you think about the concept of activism, I think activism is, it can be very small things, very big things. I got my sons a copy of the book Bedtime Stories for Rebel Girls, and I've been reading particular stories to them. And the absolute horror on their face when they hear stories about women not being allowed to go to university, not being allowed to vote, not being allowed to finish school. Those sorts of stories, through the eyes of women who have excelled in the past, have, really raised their consciousness. But also, I think many people in the audience will remember a couple of years ago, here in Australia, we did a survey on the attitudes of young people, and many young men, I think it was about 64% of the men surveyed in that very big survey thought it was okay to press their sexual intentions on a woman, on a young girl, after they had said no. So there are clearly attitudes that absolutely need to change if we are ever going to achieve equality in our democracy. And safety and sexual safety has got to be fundamental to that going forward. But just finally, before I finish, Jackie, what you said about systemic change, and I am so proud of the fact, and Di Farmer, the Minister for Women here in Queensland, is here. Yay, Di. I'm so proud of the fact that we have 50% political representation in the Labor Party caucus in Parliament and sitting around the cabinet table. But let me just say that changing systems and reform is so hard. It's so hard, and you don't just get it, and the expectation that women, because they assume political leadership, are going to change the system overnight is setting women up for failure. And I think we need to be absolutely conscious about that. I, for one, think that I have an enormous responsibility to put and progress the views and the ambitions of women, and women right across the spectrum, whether they're women in prison who are being punished as opposed to rehabilitated, or women who are seeking to have access to safe legal abortion in this state, and abortion is still a crime in this state under the criminal code, and something that we want to fix and change for future generations. So I really believe that part of my responsibility as a feminist and as a leader is to actually go out there and say the hard things that is very difficult for a lot of people to say because of the punishment that they will receive, or because of the things that will be said about their position. And someone absolutely needs to lead the way on some of these really, really hard conversations around reform. It won't happen overnight. We know that my experience is it's a long, hard moving beast, and Jackie will know this more than anyone in relation to getting Indigenous influence in the decision-making processes of our nation. It's a hard, slow-moving, lumbering beast. But once you achieve change, nothing again is ever the same, and that's what we always need to keep remembering. I just wanted to add on the issue, I guess, of ageing and how we care and view older people in our community. I mean, this is going to become an increasing issue as those people aged 65 and older continue to be a growing cohort within our population. And I really do think that as public policy makers, how we plan, how we care for our ageing population is going to be an issue of great criticality. Of course, we need to change the way that we look at older people, and I'm really conscious of their invisibility in our society. People don't make eye contact, or, don't acknowledge. And I think that we need to start changing that and have as much exposure. Like, one of the things I do with my kids is make sure that they have a lot of exposure to their grandparents and actually understand the value of that interaction. It's really critical and important going forward, but it's something that I think as public policy makers we absolutely need to be attuned to, because there is going to be a crisis in our nation around caring for older Australians unless we get on top of it.
There are a few things before we end I just want to say. One is this. There is something I referred to at the beginning called CEDAW, which is something that was created in 1979, 40 years ago, and a legislation passed in the UN that covers all areas of gender rights. And yet, 40 years later, despite that nearly every nation has signed up to it, with the exception of Iraq, Sudan, and the USA, well, there are a few others, but those are the main ones. What does that mean? What does it mean to pass legislation like that at that level if countries can't enact it? And I think it means that not enough women were there to make it happen. And that's why this conversation is so critical. You can pass all the laws you like, but unless you have cultural change, that won't happen. And that means having legal change, but it also means being in a participational relationship to change. And the second thing I want to say is that I know from other women politicians and women in high office, and referring to your point as well as why you might not want to do it, is that women like this put themselves into personal jeopardy. It's the word I used last night. There's threats against your life, there's insults on a daily level, there's a Twitter storm, which is really particularly nasty for women. And, it's not such a good job often. And so we have to really applaud the fact that you're doing it. We need you to do it. And we have to also have the courage to stand in that space ourselves, because we can't have quotas if there aren't enough women to fill them. So, I know that women politicians sometimes get a raw deal as well, from the public as well as their own fellows. So we have to support women in office. And the final thing I'd say, since you're going out now to a coffee and tea break, is that this is a perfect opportunity to go and talk to people you don't know. If there's one thing that WOW is about, it's about saying, okay, I heard you say something about, disability. I don't know enough about it. I'd like to be less ignorant, or I don't know enough about what it's like to lead, a life as a teacher or this or that, the other. Find out about each other. Enjoy the fact that we don't know each other. And, this is how we create women's solidarity, actually, just by being able to understand that we can't live somebody else's life. We can't speak for them, but we can know more about each other. So can I just thank this amazing group of women for being so candid. It was a joy. And have a nice WOW day. Carry on.